The first thing I remember is the sound. Not voices, not sirens, just that sharp metallic knock echoing off the concrete under the bridge, too hollow, too empty for something that was supposed to be solid. The river below was low that day, sliding past in slow brown-green bands that smelled faintly of mud and cold stone. Dust hung in the air where the workers had chipped away at the old surface, a pale gray haze drifting in the weak autumn light. I stood off to the side and my jacket fingers curled around a paper cup that had already gone lukewarm, listening as one of the men said quieter than he meant to, "That's not right." The hydraulic hammer went silent, and for a few long seconds all I could hear was the tick of cooling metal and the river pushing against its banks. Someone shone a flashlight into the opening they'd made, and the beam touched something inside the concrete that didn't look like concrete at all. The breeze shifted then, carrying the smell of wet cement and river algae toward us, and every tiny hair on my arm stood up as if my body understood something my mind was still refusing to name. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I didn't grow up thinking much about bridges. They were just part of the landscape in western Washington, the way gray skies and evergreens and coffee shops on every corner were. By 2014, I was 27, working as a nurse at a little community clinic not far from downtown Seattle, and most days my life was measured in blood pressure readings, prescription refills, and the soft squeak of my shoes on linoleum floors. In the mornings, I'd drive in along wet streets that smelled like rain and exhaust. The skyline edged in blue-gray against low clouds, and I'd pass the same faces waiting at the same bus stops, shoulders hunched into their jackets. The city had a rhythm. You could almost set your watch by delivery trucks backing into alleys, espresso machines, hissing bicycles humming over damp pavement. It all felt ordinary back then, steady and familiar, like a song you've heard so often you stop listening to the words. Evan and Grace lived about 20 minutes from my apartment in a small 2-story house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Their place had one of those modest white porches that seemed made for late evenings and chipped coffee mugs. Nothing grand, just a set of steps, a railing, and a wide enough space for 2 folding chairs and a potted fern that never quite thrived. When you opened their front door, you stepped into the smell of brewed coffee and laundry detergent, and usually there was some kind of music playing low in the background, old folk records that Evan liked, or the bright bouncy songs Grace used in her classroom. The living room had soft lamps instead of harsh overhead lights, a scuffed wooden coffee table and a worn purple throw blanket draped over the back of the couch, always a little crooked, no matter how many times Grace straightened it. It was the kind of house where you automatically took a deep breath when you walked in, because some places just make your shoulders drop a little. Evan was 3 years older than me, and even when we were kids, he'd carried himself like someone who'd been born responsible. By the time he hit 30, he was a civil engineer with a stack of project folders on his desk and a closet full of neatly pressed shirts, the sleeves rolled precisely once at the wrist. He loved numbers, clean lines, the way a good design could turn steel and concrete into something that looked effortless. But if you watched him when he talked about his work, you noticed the small things, the way his fingers traced invisible shapes on the table when he described a load-bearing column, or how his jaw tightened when he mentioned corners being cut. That spring and summer he was involved in work related to a state bridge over the Snoqualmie River, a big deal even if he tried to pretend it wasn't. More than once I saw him with the project drawings spread out on their kitchen table, the paper smelling faintly of toner and coffee as he leaned over the lines with that familiar furrow between his brows. Grace softened everything around him. At 28, she was the kind of elementary teacher kids remembered years later, the one who kept stickers in her desk drawer and knew how to pronounce every child's name correctly by the second day of school. She wore soft sweaters and sensible shoes and somehow always had a faint trace of dry erase marker on her fingers. Her classroom, she once told me over dinner, smelled like crayons and construction paper and the peanut butter sandwiches the kids weren't technically supposed to bring. At home, that warmth followed her. She kept fresh flowers in a chipped mason jar on the table, usually daisies or something purple, and there were always graded papers tucked between cookbooks on the counter. When she laughed, it filled the whole room in an easy, unself-conscious way that made you want to find the joke again just to hear it one more time. The two of them fit together in a way that made sense, like two pieces from entirely different puzzles that somehow still clicked. Where Evan was quiet, Grace was bright. Where he measured twice, she just smiled and stepped forward. Their shared language was the mountains. Every few weeks, especially once the snow melted back from the higher trails, they'd load up their old charcoal gray SUV boots in the back, a faded blue tent, metal mugs, a dented thermos that smelled like strong coffee and pine needles. Their hallway closet was a jumble of backpacks and rolled-up sleeping pads and neatly coiled ropes that Evan would check, tugging each knot with calloused fingers. They knew the trails east of Seattle, the way other people knew restaurant menus, Lake Ingalls, Mason Lake, Snow Lake, a string of names that to them meant switchbacks, alpine light, and the particular creak of old pines in the wind. Our parents watched those trips with a kind of cautious admiration. Mom Mary would sit at their small kitchen table during Sunday dinners, the aroma of pot roast and roasted onions filling the house, and ask, "You two are going prepared, right?" Her fingers would worry the edge of a paper napkin, twisting it into a little rope. Dad would pretend to be absorbed in whatever game was murmuring from the living room TV, his fork scraping softly against his plate, but I'd catch the way his eyes slid toward Evan whenever avalanche reports or search and rescue stories showed up on the local news. Still, they trusted them. Evan had been carrying topographical maps around since he was in high school, and Grace knew her way around a first aid kit better than most people I treated in my clinic. If there were cracks in that neat picture, they were small at first, the kind you only notice when you go back and look with everything you've learned since. I remember one evening in early spring, before the days stretched out and the air on their street still held that cold, wet edge. I'd stopped by to drop off a set of old hiking poles Grace wanted to borrow for one of her students' parents. Evan was at the table with his laptop open, a spreadsheet glowing pale in the lamplight and a stack of printed memos beside him. The room smelled faintly of ink and tomato sauce. Grace had left a pot of something simmering on the stove, the lid rattling quietly when it boiled too hard. As I walked in, he snapped the folder nearest him, shut the paper whispering under his hand, and gave me a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "What's that about?" I'd asked, nodding toward the closed file as I shrugged off my jacket and felt the lingering dampness of the evening on my sleeves. "Just bridge stuff," he said, rubbing the side of his thumb along his coffee mug, leaving a crescent of moisture on the ceramic. "Some suppliers think close enough is good enough. It's not." His voice was calm, but there was a strain underneath, a tautness like a guitar string tuned just a little too high. Grace breezed in from the kitchen, then a wooden spoon in her hand, her cheeks flushed from the stove's heat and the scent of garlic and basil trailing after her. "He's been arguing with people in hard hats and suits all day," she joked, bumping his shoulder lightly. "I keep telling him, honey, you're going to give yourself wrinkles before your time." The moment passed with a laugh. Plates pulled from the cabinet, steam rising off pasta, swirled onto our dishes. But I remember the way Evan's hand stilled on the fork when his phone buzzed, screen flashing a number he didn't recognize, and how he pressed his lips together before flipping it over face down, letting it ring out on the table. By June, the light lingered late over Seattle, turning the windows of their neighborhood a warm gold before sliding away into that soft blue-gray that seemed particular to the Pacific Northwest. On warm evenings, kids rode scooters back and forth on the cracked sidewalks, the plastic wheels rasping over the concrete, while someone's radio played old rock songs through an open garage. On days I got off work early, I'd stop by their house and find Grace on the porch, bare feet up on the railing, a glass of iced tea sweating in her hand. You could hear the gentle click of sprinklers from a few doors down and smell fresh-cut grass hanging in the cool air. She'd wave me up the boards under my shoes, creaking softly, and talk about her students who'd finally mastered long division, who couldn't stop talking, who drew mountains in the margins of their worksheets. Evan, on those nights, was often in the small back room they'd turned into a kind of shared office. His side held binders and rolled blueprints, a metal ruler, and a cup full of sharply pointed pencils. Hers had stacks of lesson plans, colored markers, and construction paper in bright, uneven piles. The desk lamp cast a narrow cone of yellow light onto his paperwork, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. I'd stand in the doorway for a moment, listening to the quiet scratch of his pencil and the distant hum of traffic from the main road, and he'd look up with that tired, familiar half-smile. Almost done, he'd say more to himself than to me. The bridge came up again and again in those months, not as a story he was proud to tell, but as a weight he was trying to carry correctly. One afternoon in late July, I ran into him downtown near a construction site, the smell of wet concrete and hot asphalt thick in the air. Steel beams rose up against a white-blue sky, and the clatter of machinery echoed between the buildings. He'd just come from a meeting. His tie loosened the collar of his shirt, slightly damp from the heat. We walked a block together, his steps measured on the uneven sidewalk. "Do you ever feel like you're the only one yelling about something?" he asked suddenly, watching a crane swing slowly overhead. "And everyone else just keeps nodding along, pretending they don't hear you." I remember the grit of dust under my shoes, the way sunlight flashed off passing car windows. How I hesitated before answering. I told him that in my line of work you learned to keep raising concerns even when no one wanted to hear them. He nodded, eyes fixed ahead, jaw working once before he changed the subject. Their August trip started as so many of their trips did, with maps and weather reports, and a kitchen table turned into a planning station. A week before they left, I sat with them as they unfolded a topographical map of the Lake Ingalls area, the paper crackling softly under their hands. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, catching the dust motes in the air and turning them into tiny, drifting sparks. Grace traced a finger along the trail nails, short and clean, pausing at the small blue smudge that marked the lake. "We'll camp here," she said, tapping the spot. "And if the weather holds, we might catch a sunrise over the ridge." The room smelled like coffee, and the lemon cleaner Grace used on the table sharp, but somehow comforting. Evan checked an old hiking guide, running his thumb along the worn spine, while a fan in the corner pushed lukewarm air around the room with a steady, rhythmic whir. They moved around each other, easily packing and repacking in their heads before a single zipper slid shut. Evan talked about the elevation, the grade of the trail, how early they'd need to leave Seattle to beat traffic over the pass. Grace made a written list: first aid kit, extra socks, water filter matches, the purple fleece she liked for cold mornings. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower droned in the distance, the scent of cut grass slipping in through the screen door. At one point, Evan glanced toward his briefcase sitting in the corner, the edge of a manila folder peeking out, and I saw something tighten around his eyes for just a second. Then he reached over, folded the map, and said, "We'll be off the grid for a bit." "That's the point, right?" Grace smiled, squeezed his shoulder, and the moment folded itself back into the general clutter of decision-making. The night before they were due to leave, I stopped by to return a casserole dish Mom wanted out of their cupboard. The air was warm but soft, carrying the faint scent of barbecues from somewhere down the block and the distant hiss of tires on the main road. Their porch light was already on, even though the sky still held some color, a pale lavender strip along the horizon. Through the open window, I could hear the low murmur of their voices, the rustle of fabric, the zip of a duffel bag closing. When Evan opened the door, his hair was damp from a shower, and he smelled faintly of clean soap and the spicy aftershave he only used on special occasions. Inside, the house felt half settled and half in motion. Boots lined up by the door laces tucked inside, a thermos sitting ready on the counter next to a bag of coffee, the rich scent already in the air. Grace moved through the living room in thick socks, a stack of folded clothes hugged against her chest, that familiar purple fleece on top. The soft light from their lamps pooled on the hardwood floors, leaving the corners in gentle shadow. We talked about small things. The weather forecast, my schedule at the clinic, Mom insisting they text her when they got to the trailhead. Once during a lull, Evan's phone lit up on the coffee table with an unknown number, the screen glowing in the dim room. He glanced at it, the reflection briefly touching his eyes, then pressed the side button to make it go dark again. "Work," he said simply. "It'll keep." I didn't think much of it then. We hugged in the doorway, the fabric of his t-shirt rough against my cheek, Grace's hair smelling like coconut shampoo when she wrapped her arms around me. Outside, the crickets had begun their steady chorus in the bushes, and a coolness was creeping into the air that made me wish I'd brought a sweater. I walked back to my car under the streetlights, their yellow glow pooling on the pavement, and glanced over my shoulder once at their house. The porch light burned steadily, casting a soft rectangle of brightness onto the steps, their SUV already backed into the driveway with its windows dark, ready for an early start. For a reason I couldn't have explained then, I stood there for a beat longer than usual, listening to the faint hum of a television somewhere down the block and the distant rush of the freeway. Then I got in my car, shut the door with a solid thud, and drove away, leaving that small square of light behind me in the mirror shining just a little too bright against the deepening night. I remember how ordinary that Sunday felt at first. The kind of Seattle evening where the sky turns a faded pink before sliding into gray, and you can smell the damp earth cooling after a warm day. I had finished a long shift at the clinic and was sitting on my couch with the windows cracked open, letting in the sound of distant traffic and a faint hint of cedar from the trees outside. I wasn't thinking about anything heavy, just sorting bills, folding laundry, still warm from the dryer, letting the steady hum of the dishwasher fill the small apartment. It was almost 7 when I glanced at my phone and realized I hadn't heard from either Evan or Grace. Not a text, not a photo, not even one of Grace's quick check-ins that usually came when they hit the trailhead or found a good view. At first I told myself it made sense. The mountains swallowed cell service all the time. They were probably driving back, winding along those narrow roads where signal dropped without warning. But then I noticed something else. My mom had called me twice. Dad once. A text from my mom sat unread. "Have you heard from them?" It wasn't her words that got me. It was the timestamp. She'd sent it over an hour earlier. Mom didn't worry unless she had reason. I tried calling Evan first. The phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. I tried Grace. Same thing. The sound that followed the empty click of the call ending felt sharp in the quiet room. I called Mom back, my voice lighter than it felt. "I'm sure they're on their way," I said. "The service is spotty out there." She agreed, but I could hear something fraying underneath the way her breath caught the way she paused before every answer. Outside my window, the streetlights flickered to life, their warm yellow glow pressing into the growing dark. By 8, the air in my apartment felt too still. I stepped out onto my small balcony, the metal railing cool beneath my palms. Somewhere below, a dog barked short and irritated. A couple walked past their conversation, drifting up in broken pieces, the clatter of a metal leash, the scuff of shoes over concrete. Normal sounds, everyday sounds. They felt wrong next to the silence coming from my brother's phone. I tried them both again. Straight to voicemail. I sent a text knowing full well it wouldn't deliver. "Everything okay? Call me." I watched the little sending bar creep forward and then stall, the gray circle spinning like it was waiting for someone who wasn't there. Around that time, Grace's parents tried calling me too. Their voices were tighter, the worry more pronounced. "They should have been off the trail by now," Thomas said, the line crackling. "Even if they stopped for dinner." His words trailed off, swallowed by doubt. Margaret asked if maybe they'd changed their plans, maybe stayed another night. But both of us knew Evan he planned down to the minute. If he said he'd be home Sunday evening, he meant it. I told myself over and over that I shouldn't panic. The mountains were vast, the roads unpredictable. Maybe they'd gotten a late start hiking down. Maybe they were stuck behind traffic near the pass. Maybe their phones died. I recited these explanations like a rosary, each one meant to keep fear from settling too deeply. But each minute without a call stretched thinner, pulled tighter like a thread ready to snap. By 9:30, I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The hallway outside my apartment smelled faintly of somebody's reheated leftovers and the lemon cleaner the building's maintenance guy used on weekends. My footsteps echoed in the stairwell hollow and sharp, the air cool on my face as I stepped outside. The sky had darkened completely now, the clouds low and heavy, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. When I started my car, the engine's rumble felt too loud in the stillness, like I was disturbing something that didn't want to be touched. I didn't have a plan. I just couldn't sit still anymore. I drove toward their neighborhood with the window cracked, cool air brushing against my cheek. As I watched house after house drift past soft porch lights, blinds drawn, radios murmuring behind windows. Normal life moving on. It made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. When I turned onto their street, I saw their house lit just the way they always left it for a late return porch light, on a lamp inside glowing through the sheer living room curtain. But their SUV wasn't in the driveway. The gravel space beside their house sat empty, the faint chalky outline of tires still visible like an imprint left behind. I parked and walked up the steps. The boards creaked under my weight, that familiar sound I'd heard dozens of times, but tonight it felt too loud. I rang the doorbell even though I knew they weren't inside. The chime rang out soft and echoing, drifting through the house like it was searching for someone. When no one answered, I pressed my forehead lightly against the door, the wood cool beneath my skin. A light wind rustled the small fern plant Grace kept on the porch table, brushing its fronds together with a gentle whisper. I tried to laugh it off. "They're probably stuck in traffic," I whispered to myself, but those words no longer sounded convincing. Not even to me. I sat on their porch couch for nearly half an hour, listening to the low hum of streetlights and the distant thrum of a passing train somewhere beyond the trees. The night grew colder and I pulled my jacket tighter, shivering when a breeze swept across my arms. I imagined their drive home, the winding mountain road, the dark stretch of forest, where the headlights carved narrow tunnels through the trees, the long silence when phones drift out of range. I tried to picture them chatting, laughing, replaying their favorite parts of the hike. I tried to make it feel real, but all I felt was absence. Around 10:15, I called the ranger station near the trail. A tired voice answered, the kind of voice that sounded like it had been fielding calls since dawn. I explained who I was, gave Evan and Grace's names, told him they hadn't returned as planned. He asked what trail they'd been on. When I said Lake Ingalls, there was a slight pause on the other end. "That's a busy area this time of year," he said. "Lots of hikers. They probably just lost track of time." His tone was meant to soothe, but the words drifted through my mind like smoke, thin, insubstantial. He took down their details, promised to check if anyone had reported seeing them, and told me to call back if I heard anything. I thanked him, hung up, and stared out into the quiet street, feeling something inside me slip. I called my parents next. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice small. "Any news?" she asked. Dad was with her. I could hear the faint murmur of his voice, the scrape of a kitchen chair being pulled closer. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much at all. Mom kept repeating, "Maybe they took a wrong exit. Maybe they stopped to eat," as if saying it enough times would make it true. Dad didn't say much, but I could hear him breathing, slow, steady, like he was trying to keep himself anchored. As the night deepened, something in me shifted. The denial slipped away, inch by inch. Fear settled in its place, not loud or dramatic, but cold and certain. A steady ache at the base of my ribs. a tightness behind my eyes. I found myself listening to every sound around me, the rustle of leaves, the groan of a distant truck, even the quiet chirp of an insect near the porch light. Each noise seemed to highlight their absence, as if the world around me was continuing while they were paused somewhere out of reach. By 11, even their neighbor Doris flicked on her porch light, the glow casting long shadows across the yard. She stepped outside in her robe, holding a mug of tea between her hands, steam rising into the cool air. "Expected them back tonight, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft and worn. When I nodded, she frowned, lines deepening around her eyes. "They're punctual folks," she said. "Always have been." She stared down the street as if expecting headlights to appear. None did. It was close to midnight when I finally stood, my legs stiff from sitting so long. The air had grown colder still, the kind of chill that works its way through your clothes and settles into your bones. I rubbed my hands together, trying to warm them, but the unease stayed. I took one last look at the empty driveway, the gravel pale under the porch light, undisturbed. The plant on the table shifted again in the breeze, its leaves brushing against each other like a quiet warning. And then as I turned to leave, I heard a low engine rumble from the far end of the street. Blue and red lights flickered briefly through the trees, casting faint color across the quiet houses. A sheriff's cruiser eased around the corner, moving slowly, deliberately, its headlights sweeping over parked cars and darkened lawns. It pulled into the driveway beside me and stopped. The engine clicked as it settled into silence. The deputy stepped out, his boots crunching softly over the gravel, and when he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he removed his hat and held it against his chest for a moment. He looked up at me with a steady, somber expression, and in the quiet space between us, filled with the hum of the cruiser's radio and the distant pulse of night insects, I felt the last sliver of denial slip away. By the time the deputy stepped onto the porch that night, the air had dipped into that sharp, late summer chill that settles over King County when the heat of the day drains off the pavement. His boots pressed softly into the gravel, and the cruiser's lights cast a pale wash over the front of the house, turning the windows into flat rectangles of gold. He spoke gently, asking me when I'd last heard from Evan and Grace, what time they were due back, which trail they'd taken. I told him everything, my voice steadier than I felt the cool night air drying out my throat as I answered question after question. He took notes under the porch light, his pen glinting each time it caught the glow, and though he stayed calm, I could see something in his expression tighten the more I talked. When he stepped back to radio in the situation, the static drifted across the yard in thin bursts, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a delay anymore. The worry had crossed a line. Something bigger was starting now. Not long after, another cruiser rolled up, then an unmarked SUV. A ranger from the district arrived wearing a windbreaker with patches on both sleeves, and the smell of wet pine clung to him as if he'd come straight from the woods. He asked for copies of their hiking plan, the model of their boots, the color of their jackets. I dug through my texts, scrolling past old photos, sunlit trails, lakes the color of steel, a smiling shot of Grace holding up a bag of trail mix like a trophy. I had to look away for a second before handing over my phone. They worked quickly, faster than I expected at that hour. Maps were pulled from the ranger's truck, spread across the hood, the paper weighted down with flashlights and a thermos someone had brought from the station. The night air carried that damp, mossy scent that comes off the foothills when the temperature drops. A deputy leaned close to the map, tracing the trail with his finger, murmuring to the ranger about ridgelines and choke points where hikers sometimes got turned around. Their quiet, clipped voices blended with the breeze rustling through the maples along the street. Around 2 a.m, they decided to head to the trailhead. They told me I didn't have to go, but I followed anyway, driving behind the convoy with my headlights carving a narrow path through the dark. The roads were quiet except for the occasional truck rumbling past, its red taillights fading into the distance like embers. The deeper we drove into the mountains, the cooler the air became, and soon the scent of cedar and river stone seeped in through my cracked window. It was a smell I'd always associated with peace with the hikes I'd taken with my brother growing up. That night it felt entirely different, too sharp, too clean, like the air itself was waiting. The Lake Ingalls parking area looked ghostly under the Rangers' flood lamp. Their SUV sat off to the side, coated in a thin layer of dust exactly where they had parked it days earlier. Dew clung to the windshield, glittering under the artificial light, and their registration card still sat on the dashboard where they'd tucked it. I pressed my hand against the driver's side window, the glass cold beneath my palm. Inside, everything was neat, just the way Evan kept their car. A phone charger coiled beside the gear shift, a folded map in the side pocket, a half-empty bottle of water rolling gently with each vibration from the flood lamp generator. The Rangers took photos, circled the car, checked for signs of forced entry. There were none. The gravel around the tires held faint impressions, but they looked like ordinary boot prints, nothing definitive. A deputy knelt brushing the ground with gloved fingers, lifting a bit of grit to inspect under the light. When he stood, he shook his head slightly. Nothing unusual, nothing useful. Just after dawn, a faint wash of pale pink crept over the ridgeline, and I could hear birds beginning to stir in the trees. The search team was larger now, more deputies, more rangers. A pair of volunteers who looked like they'd gotten a call and dressed before they were fully awake. They carried radios clipped to their vests, the devices crackling to life with bursts of static and quiet voices. A search dog named Jasper arrived with his handler, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and the kind of calm presence that comes from years of work like this. She let Jasper sniff one of Evan's old hiking socks Mom had brought from home. The dog's ears twitched. He let out a low whine, then pulled forward ready. I watched them disappear up the trail, their boots crunching over gravel and roots, their voices fading into the morning air. The sky brightened slowly, revealing more of the mountains, jagged lines of rock pockets of shadow where the sun hadn't yet reached. The air smelled like wet earth and cold stone, the kind of smell that settles in your clothes and stays there. Hours passed. Teams checked the first mile, then the second. They split up near a fork in the trail, their silhouettes shrinking into the trees, radios clipped to their shoulders, the antennas bobbing with each step. Each time a radio crackled, I held my breath. Each time it went silent again, something sank deeper inside me. One team reported what looked like fresh prints heading toward the ridge, 2 sets side by side heading north. My heart jumped just for a second. But by the time rangers reached the spot, the prints were partial at best, smudged by earlier hikers, distorted by loose stone. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. They followed the faint impressions anyway until the trail banked into a slope of scattered rock, where any trace vanished as if the ground had simply swallowed them. Around noon, a volunteer called in something fabric caught on a bush near a narrow switchback. I reached the area as deputies examined it. A scrap of cloth, blue-gray, fluttering softly in the breeze. My pulse thudded in my ears as they turned it over, checking the texture, the stitching. The ranger shook his head. Wrong material. Torn nylon from an old backpack, sun-faded and weather-worn. When he let it fall, it drifted to the ground like a leaf. The day stretched on in a blur of movement and waiting. Helicopters arrived, their blades chopping the air, sending dust swirling into small clouds around the trailhead. The thrum of the rotors vibrated through my chest as they lifted off, scanning the ridges with thermal cameras. I watched them bank over the mountains, their shadows sweeping across the valleys below. But when they landed again, the pilots stepped out, shaking their heads. No heat signatures, no unusual shapes, nothing. By late afternoon, maps were spread across the hoods of 3 different vehicles. The rangers marked off sections they'd covered thick red ink, circling areas cleared by foot or by air. The search coordinator ran his finger along a contour line and said they'd have to check the ravine north of the ridge. It wasn't likely, he said, but they couldn't ignore it. I watched them go, the sound of their boots fading into the distance until only the steady hum of the trailhead generator remained. As the day cooled, more volunteers arrived, Locals, hikers, people who'd seen the story on early news alerts. Some brought extra water and granola bars for the teams. Some brought headlamps and trekking poles. All of them carried the same look concern mixed with determination, and beneath that, the fear that they were too late for something they didn't want to name. There were theories whispered at the edges of conversations. Maybe Evan and Grace had wandered off trail chasing a viewpoint. Maybe one of them twisted an ankle and they tried to take a shortcut back. Maybe they split up, one going ahead for help. A volunteer from Ellensburg spoke softly about a hunter who'd gone missing in the same area 10 years earlier. A deputy mentioned black bear sightings further up the valley, though quickly added the chances were slim. Someone else wondered aloud about unstable footing near the ridge loose shale sudden drops. Each explanation tried to make the puzzle fit. None of them settled right. As night crept closer, a cold wind swept down from the higher peaks, carrying the scent of stone dust and dry pine needles. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, my fingers stiff from gripping the sleeves. The trailhead lights came on one by one, bathing the gravel lot in a sterile white glow. Their SUV sat there unchanged, the dust dulling its paint, its windows reflecting the searchlights in long, distorted lines. I remember leaning against the hood of a Ranger truck, the metal cool against my back, listening to the muted murmur of voices around me. The team leads discussed the next day's plan, marking new zones on the map. Volunteers shifted quietly, rubbing sore calves, flexing tired fingers. Somewhere behind me, a radio crackled with the faint sound of a distant team checking in. Nothing found. Again. Exhaustion settled in like a heavy coat, making everything feel slower, heavier. I rubbed my eyes, the grit on my fingertips reminding me how long I'd been awake. When I looked up at the mountains, their silhouettes were sharp against the fading sky, immovable and silent, as if they held something and weren't ready to give it back. Just before full darkness, a deputy approached from the direction of the trail, a small object cradled carefully in his hands. His expression was unreadable, his steps deliberate as he made his way toward the command area. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of distant campfire smoke and crushed leaves. As he reached the edge of the floodlight's glow, he paused, looking toward the search coordinator. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, louder this time. Something had come in. Something they couldn't ignore. And in that quiet moment, with the night settling over the mountains and every whisper of wind sounding sharper than before, I felt the air around us change, subtle, heavy, like the forest itself was bracing for what would come next. The deputy, who'd been holding that small object the night before, approached the command area with a tightness in his shoulders that made every conversation around him fall away. His boots scraped lightly over the gravel, the sound strangely sharp in the cool evening air. I remember the wind shifting just then, carrying with it the smell of pine needles crushed underfoot, and the faint bite of dust kicked up by the search teams returning from the ridge. No one spoke as he handed the object a metal wristwatch, mud-stained and dented, to the search coordinator. The face was cracked. The hands were frozen in place. Even before they confirmed it belonged to Evan. My chest tightened so abruptly I had to grip the edge of the truck behind me to stay upright. The air felt thin, as if the shadows crowding the trailhead had pulled all the oxygen out of the space around us. Radios crackled to life right after the calm tones replaced by clipped urgency. A ranger's voice came through wind whipping past his microphone. Something had been found near the lower river bridge, not on the trail, not in the backcountry, but beneath one of the concrete supports. The words hit with a strange, muffled weight, as if I were hearing them through water. The search coordinator's jaw tightened. He signaled the deputies to gear up and turned toward me with a look that told me I needed to go home, but that he already knew I wouldn't. When we left the trailhead, the convoy moved as one headlights carving narrow paths through the dark forest roads, dust lifting behind our wheels like pale smoke in the night air. The drive felt endless, even though it couldn't have been more than 40 minutes. The closer we got to the river, the colder the air became, carrying that mineral smell of flowing water and wet stone. When we arrived, floodlights were already in place, their harsh beams reflecting off the metal rails of the Snoqualmie River Bridge. Construction equipment sat idle beside the riverbank, their silhouettes looming in the sharp artificial light. Workers in reflective vests stood off to the side, arms folded across their chests, their faces set in uneasy stillness. It wasn't part of the search effort. This was a bridge maintenance crew, and something about their presence made my heart thud harder. I walked toward the group gathered near one of the central pillars. The river moved slowly below its surface, broken by small eddies and the occasional glint of reflected light. The air smelled like mud and concrete dust, thick enough that I could feel it settle on my tongue. One of the workers, a man with weathered hands and a tremor in his voice, explained that during routine repairs, their equipment had hit a hollow patch in the concrete. Not a hairline fracture, not erosion, a cavity. Something that had no business existing inside a bridge support. Deputies set up tape around the area, the bright yellow ribbon flicking back and forth in the breeze. A portable generator rumbled to life, sending a mechanical hum across the riverbank. I could feel the vibration through the soles of my shoes. When the workers peeled away the loose concrete with metal bars, dust floated up in soft gray clouds, catching the light like drifting ash. Every hammer strike echoed through the hollow chamber beneath the bridge, a deep, haunting sound that settled in my bones. Then one of the deputies signaled sharply, his flashlight beam fixed inside the opening. Everything stopped. Even the generator seemed quieter. I stepped closer, instinctively holding my breath. The concrete dust hung thick in the air, dimming the beam of the flashlights. A deputy crouched low, reaching his arm into the cavity with slow, deliberate movements, as if he feared disturbing something sacred or dangerous. When he leaned back, his voice was unsteady. There were shapes inside human shapes preserved in the dry, sheltered chamber. Two figures seated against one another. One leaning forward, arms curled as if holding someone close. The other tucked into that embrace, their forms fused by time and pressure and silence. My legs nearly gave out. I felt the cold night air fill my lungs in shallow breaths, the taste of concrete dust drying out my mouth. Someone put a hand on my shoulder. I couldn't tell who. The work lights cast long, distorted shadows of the deputies as they widened the opening, careful not to disturb what lay inside. I could hear the river rushing beneath us, slow and steady, as if unaware of the truth that had been entombed just above it. The bodies, reduced to skeletal remains, were intact enough to show they'd been placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not trapped. Placed. The clothing was still present in fragments, denim stiff with age, faded fabric caught against bone. And then in a corner of the cavity the light hit something soft, something that held color even after all those years. A piece of purple cloth. It folded in the draft from the work lights, trembling almost imperceptibly in the cold air. Grace's favorite fleece. It took everything I had to stay standing. The scene blurred for a moment, the light streaking across my vision. I swallowed hard against the nausea creeping up the back of my throat. In all the weeks and months of hoping for some sign, any sign, I never imagined this would be where their trail ended. The medical examiner's team arrived quickly, their van rumbling onto the gravel with a low growl. The air shifted as they began carefully documenting the site, the clicking of cameras and the metallic whisper of tools filling the silence. When the remains were lifted out, bone by bone, fabric by fabric, the workers bowed their heads. Even the river seemed quieter, as though it knew the weight of what was being carried out from beneath the bridge. Detectives gathered us under the floodlights. Their faces were pale grim. One of them explained that the bodies had been inside the pillar for years, long before the hike, long before anyone realized something darker was hidden inside the bones of the structure itself. He spoke plainly, but his voice wavered when he told me there were gunshot wounds visible on the ribs and skull. 2 different angles, 2 different victims. I couldn't feel my feet anymore. My hands shook as I pressed them against the hood of a deputy's car, the cold metal anchoring me to the moment. The world felt too quiet, too sharp. Even the river noise faded into a distant hum. When they said the words confirmed identities, Evan Grace, the sounds didn't seem to belong to the English language. They floated around me like unfamiliar syllables. My brother, my sister-in-law, hidden inside a structure he had once inspected for safety. Detectives began piecing together the timeline, their voices low and methodical. They referenced the project records from the year before. Evan disappeared the notes he'd filed about faulty materials, his warnings about compromised concrete. They talked about the contractor who had overseen the project, a man who'd pushed back hard, who'd wanted the job finished quietly. The name they spoke, Jack Morrison, hit like a blunt object I'd been bracing for without realizing it. It made terrible sense. Every detail from the past, every unease I'd felt watching Evan pore over documents late at night, cascaded into a single awful truth. This had never been an accident in the mountains. This had been murder. The minutes after that felt like hours. Deputies stringing more tape, the medical team moving with reverent focus, the lights humming overhead like an oppressive drone. At some point, I sank onto a cold patch of gravel near the riverbank, hands folded tight in my lap. A ranger knelt beside me and offered water, but I couldn't bring myself to lift the bottle. My throat felt locked, the air around me too dense to swallow. My parents arrived shortly after, their faces pale under the harsh lights. My mother let out a sound I'd never heard from her before, a soft, broken exhale that cut through the night more than any siren could have. My father stood rigid beside her, staring at the bridge, as though trying to understand how steel and concrete could be used as a grave. Investigators sealed the cavity and covered the area with tarps. They treated the site like a crime scene from the first moment, documenting every inch, collecting samples of the concrete, gathering small fragments that might hold traces of the construction timeline. I watched them work, dazed, my hands numb from the cold Michigan air rolling off the water. Every movement around me felt slow, precise, as though the night itself were holding its breath. As dawn approached, the floodlights dimmed slightly against the first gray hints of morning. A detective approached me with a softness I wasn't prepared for. He said they'd need formal statements from all of us. They'd be moving the remains to the county medical examiner as soon as the scene was cleared. They had already contacted the prosecutor's office. I nodded, though the motion felt disconnected from my body. When I stood, my knees wobbled. The detective steadied me with a light touch on my elbow, his hand warm against my cold skin. The air smelled faintly of engines cooling concrete, dust settling, and the ever-present river moving calmly beneath a bridge that no longer felt like part of the world I knew. We drove back to town in a quiet convoy, the early morning light bleeding slowly into the sky. The sheriff's office waited ahead, harsh fluorescent lights, forms to sign, statements to give. A long day of truth I had never wanted. As I stepped out of the cruiser, the weight of it all pressed hard against my chest. The revelation had torn away every last thread of hope we'd held on to, leaving only the path toward justice. I took a long, unsteady breath, bracing myself for the hours ahead, knowing that nothing in my life or anyone's in my family would ever return to the world we knew before that hollow pillar finally gave up its secret. The hours after they pulled Evan and Grace from that concrete chamber passed in a slow, fractured kind of silence, the kind that settles into your bones before you even realize you've stopped breathing normally. At the sheriff's office, everything smelled like burnt coffee and copier ink, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead with an unkind sharpness. Detectives moved carefully around us, speaking in low voices, their radios crackling with updates we weren't meant to interpret. My mother sat beside me in the hallway, her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup she never drank from the steam fading as the night wore on. My father stood with one palm braced against the wall, his head bowed, the tile cool beneath his shoes. Every now and then, someone from law enforcement walked past carrying boxes sealed with evidence tape, and each sight, each thud of cardboard against the floor carved the truth a little deeper. When the medical examiner confirmed what we already knew, the room shifted in that small, final way you feel when hope has run out of places to hide. The deputies spoke gently, explaining that the remains would be taken for examination first thing in the morning, that we would be notified when identification was formally established. They didn't have to say the words. We had already felt the weight of them hours before under the bridge with the river pulling softly at the dark water. I remember stepping outside the building before dawn, the air cold enough to sting my lungs, and staring at the pale slice of sky just beginning to brighten. The street was empty, the early morning quiet broken only by the distant hum of a passing truck. I felt untethered, as if I were floating above the pavement, waiting to be pulled back into a world I no longer recognized. News spread quickly. By mid-morning, reporters were stationed near the river, their voices carrying through the crisp air as they filmed segments for the local stations. The story hit people hard. 2 young hikers missing for years, found hidden inside a bridge support that thousands had driven over without a second thought. Neighbors left flowers on Evan and Grace's porch, soft petals gathering dew in the cool morning breeze. The mailbox filled with handwritten cards, many from people we didn't know. In the grocery store, familiar faces approached me with wide, sorrowful eyes, the kind that lingered long after the conversation ended. Even strangers at the gas station paused when they heard my last name, offering quiet condolences before stepping away. Law enforcement moved quickly. The discovery forced the case open again, and detectives began pulling old logs and construction files from storage. The concrete dust they collected at the bridge was tested, timelines re-examined, and people who had long since left the company were tracked down for questioning. Names resurfaced, some we had heard whispers about, some we hadn't. The contractor who had argued with Evan during the bridge project became the focus almost immediately. His confidence had been part of his reputation, but when deputies brought him in for formal questioning, the stillness in his expression was different. Not calm. Something colder. The investigation unfolded slowly but relentlessly, the way heavy machinery moves across uneven ground, deliberate, unstoppable. Former employees came forward with stories that painted a clearer picture than anything we'd known. Late-night concrete pours, quality shortcuts, arguments behind closed doors. One foreman, carrying years of regret in the slump of his shoulders, eventually told investigators everything, his voice low and trembling, as he recounted the night Evan and Grace disappeared. Hearing the details secondhand was its own kind of violence. It was as if I were watching shadows flicker on a wall, knowing the source of the light was too painful to look at directly. But the information gave prosecutors what they needed. By the time charges were filed, the relief in the detectives' faces was subdued, respectful, tempered by the knowledge that justice does not undo what was taken. The trial arrived the following spring. Our family sat in the front row, the wooden benches polished smooth by decades of proceedings. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and old varnish, and the ceiling fans turned slowly above us, pushing warm air in lazy circles. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens tapping softly against their notebooks, their cameras clicking between testimonies. The prosecutor spoke with measured precision, guiding the jury through timelines and construction records, through arguments over materials, through the sudden end of communication on that summer weekend years earlier. When they displayed the damaged wristwatch found near the trail, its metal scratched its hands forever. Stopped, it was placed gently on a small velvet pad, the room falling into a hush so complete I could hear the faint buzz of the exit sign. The defense argued what they could, but each day brought forward another piece of evidence, another voice, another point of connection that tied the truth together. The jury listened with furrowed brows, some taking notes, others staring straight ahead with solemn concentration. When the verdict finally came guilty on all counts, The courtroom exhaled in a wave of quiet emotion. My mother gripped my hand so tightly my fingers tingled. My father bowed his head again, but this time it was not in sorrow, it was something closer to release. The sentence ensured the man responsible would never walk free. But justice, even when rightfully delivered, carries its own complicated weight. When we left the courthouse, the air outside felt heavier, as if the world required a moment to rebalance itself. Life after the trial did not return to its earlier shape. The house Evan and Grace had shared stayed empty for months, the curtains drawn, the porch light off except when one of us went by to water the plants. Eventually, Grace's parents moved a few towns over, closer to family, searching for a quieter place to grieve. My parents found their routines shifting their days, organized around small tasks that kept them grounded. Morning walks, evening crossword puzzles, shared meals, eaten before the sun dipped behind the hills. I visited the river some afternoons, standing on the bank where the air held a faint smell of moss and cold stone. The bridge, repaired and reinforced, looked the same from a distance, but I couldn't bring myself to drive across it for a long time. Even now, when I pass it on the highway, a small knot forms in my stomach, a reminder of what the structure once concealed. At the clinic, life eventually trickled back into its usual rhythm: patients with sore knees, colds, routine checkups. But every now and then, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, the memory of that night under the floodlights returns. I'll hear the soft tap of a pen against a clipboard and be pulled back to the hum of the generator by the river, the dust in the air, the pale beam of a flashlight revealing the impossible. Some images stay with you no matter how much time passes. They become part of the landscape of your mind, landmarks you learn to navigate around without ever truly leaving behind. People sometimes ask how our family carried on after so much loss. The truth is, you don't move on, not in the way people imagine. You move forward one day, then the next, and the memories walk with you. Some mornings I wake before dawn and think of Evan's steady voice explaining the design of a bridge, or Grace laughing on their porch with her feet tucked under her. On those mornings, I take a long breath and let the air settle in my chest before starting the day. Grief doesn't vanish, but it softens around the edges, making room for the moments you lived before the world shifted. Every August now, my parents and I drive out to a quiet spot by the river. We bring flowers, sometimes wild ones gathered from the roadside, sometimes something simple from the grocery store. We stand for a few minutes in the cool morning breeze, the sound of water sliding over stone filling the space between us. We don't speak much. We don't need to. It's our way of acknowledging the place where the truth finally surfaced and the lives that ended far too soon. I think often about the courage it took for Evan to raise concerns about that project, knowing the pressure he faced. And I think of Grace, whose kindness touched so many children in her classrooms. Their absence is felt in the quiet ways: a missing seat at dinner, a porch that stays dark in the evenings, the echo of laughter that hasn't filled a room in years. But their lives mattered, and their story, painful as it is, carries a reminder about the cost of integrity and the necessity of remembering. Even now, when I stand by the river in late summer, the light filtering softly through the trees, I find myself listening to the subtle sound of water moving underneath the bridge. It's steady, unchanged, carrying pieces of the world downstream. And in that sound, I sometimes feel a strange, quiet peace, small but real, like the echo of something that refuses to disappear. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.